Hello and welcome to the Emergency Services Times podcast, where you can hear the speakers who joined us on stage at the Emergency Services Show 2024. The evolving role of fire and rescue services in a multi-agency approach to burns casualties. Krissie Stiles, a burns and plastic surgery nurse specialist, Kent Fire and Rescue Service, and London Gatwick Fire and Rescue Service share their experience of improving outcomes for burns victims.
My name is Krissie Stiles. I'm a burns plastics nurse specialist, and I've worked in burn care for over 21 years and started working with the emergency services because our service realised that you guys see our patients first and you have an opportunity to impact their quality of life outcomes much further down the line. So what you do in those very early moments really matters to years and decades later of our patients' lives. So I started interacting, starting sharing knowledge, started educating, and it resulted in the report and these collaborations that we will now present today.
Thank you.
Richard Smith. Hear me? Hello?
Keep going.
Richard Smith from Gatwick Fire and Rescue Service.
Hold on,
Can you hear me?
I think so. Can we? Oh, you might just need to adjust the mic slightly.
Can you hear me now? Yes?
There we go.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Keep going. Best. How's that?
Oh, much
Excellent.
better.
Richard Smith from Gatwick Fire and Rescue Service, one of the lead trauma and medical instructors, part of the British Burns Association Special Interest Group. I got involved around 9 years ago with Krissie and the team around how burns care is changing within the UK.
Hi. I'm Mark Rist and I'm the Director of Response and Resilience for Kent Fire and Rescue Service. We were early adopters through Krissie's work and one of our colleagues, David Wales, for the Saving Lives is Not Enough report and burns treatment, that immediate action by the Fire and Rescue Service. And we've been adopting that and adopted it across the service for the last 8 or 9 years to really good effect.
Great. Thank you. Krissie, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the report. You produced the report some time ago, so perhaps you could just give us what the origins of the report were and what you hope to achieve with it.
So the report was actually initially introduced to Kent Fire Service in 2017. It was work that culminated 6 years of research and interagency discussions that actually made us realise that there's a lot that we can learn from each other. My role was as a critical care burns nurse in a burns unit, looking after the biggest, the sickest patients that you guys rescue and you bring to us. So I knew the outcome of the burn injury that we continue seeing for years and months later, and the impact of your interventions on my patients' care and my patients' quality of life is absolutely immense. So the report stipulated 10 elements of operational response where you can intervene and you can offset the impact of elements of smoke, of fire, flame onto the patient's outcome. And the way that you can learn from what we know and how that can be implemented on scene was instrumental. So the report was produced to try and encourage the sharing of that information so that we basically improve survivors' outcomes. And it was written as a survivor-centered piece, and I hope that eventually it will be adopted finally as a survivor-centered piece across all agencies involved in rescue and care of burn survivors.
And just to be clear, when you talk about you're talking about firefighters primarily, aren't you? Because they're often first on the scene before the paramedics, and it's about your report talks about the actions they could be taking.
Often the firefighters are the first on scene, so absolutely the opportunity to intervene is from the first contact, but ultimately any emergency service on scene has that capacity. It's just the fire service have the resource that we require to make the burn injury better, which is access to water.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant, excellent. And perhaps I can ask then of Mark and Richard to talk a little bit about the journey so far. So when the report was produced, what did you take from that? What did your organisations decide to do? So,
at first glance, when Krissie talks about the most complex casualties, the most complex needs and their serious situation. I think for us as firefighters, that's incredibly daunting. You know, we've learnt to squirt water and to climb ladders and things like that. And you read the report and think it's fantastic stuff, but you know, that's high-end medical care and I'm not qualified for it. And the barrier I think that we managed to break down, supported by Krissie and investing a lot of her personal time into talking to our people, was that actually we are there in a timely fashion and we are equipped. We carry knocking 2 tons of water with us, generally speaking, and we have ready access to water, and you can't really do any harm, you can only do good. You can have some questions about the temperature of the water, the quality of the water, but again, we've had the support and advice to say that those are issues that you can overcome. And by continually giving that advice and giving that assurance, and then our colleagues starting to do it, starting to see the positive benefits, starting to understand that actually this is something they can do, that whole confidence piece is built. It's opened their thinking to what else we can do to help people, because you know, these are, you know, we often come across people in complex situations, and we can spend time looking after them before our ambulance colleagues arrive. So it's been a steady journey, but it just, success breeds success. So my sort of message to other colleagues in fire and rescue services is this is simple stuff. You just need to get over that initial daunting piece, and that's where we've gone and found successful.
And presumably some of that is about overcoming the perceptions of the firefighters themselves about what they are allowed or not allowed to do.
Yeah, yes, it's giving permissions, enabling people, letting them understand that, you know, it's, in this situation, it's, you know, essentially difficult to do harm, but it's really, really easy to do good. And that good will have potentially lifelong consequences for the individual, but it's 20 minutes of our time.
Yeah, absolutely. And from an airport fire service perspective?
So our relationship is slightly different to a local authority. So we, as an airport, deal with a lot more medical calls. So picking up scalds, thermal burns, radiation burns, and changing the mentality of pouring loads and loads of water on for a long period of time. We can come away from that, and like Mark alluded to, temperature in water has changed. We don't have to have it cold, freezing anymore. We can use that cool, tepid, warm water so that it permeates the skin. And that's introduced from first aid, whatever level of training, immediate emergency care, and then the longer scope of practice into that medical world of evacuating them to a hospital or further treatments utilising burns hospitals. But it's the fundamentals being done. You know, we do no harm, get that water on them, but in a controlled manner. And I think that's the big thing that we are changing now in the burns world.
Okay, and then from those start points, really, what have you noticed? What's different? What's working well, maybe, but what's changed, really?
I think from my perspective as a leader in a local authority fire and rescue service, as Richard says, the things we're called to are slightly different, but we do get called to sort of industrial accidents, horrible acid attacks. We very rarely get called to schools, but we are all members of society. We all have families. We have, we come across schools in life. And so the information we've been given helps in work, helps in our response, but has helped all of our colleagues away from it. You know, everybody that works for us does a basic life support course, whether you're an accountant or a firefighter. There are things you take away from working for Kent Fire and Rescue Service that are impacting your life. So this information, this understanding, the ability to respond has been useful across the piece. And I think the other thing that we bring to it, most firefighters are quite good at speaking to people. Most firefighters, particularly with the amount of community safety we do, are good at, in a nice way, putting a foot in the door and engaging with people. So whilst we can use the fire engine, we can use the water that's on the fire engine, and we should and have got the skills to get the water temperature right. We should generally keep our water clean, but we can't be sterile. We can ask for support from neighbours. You can use showers. You can then look at, well, I can protect dignity rather than irrigating somebody on the pavement. Could I take them in next door? And our people are really good advocates for it. And they're also very good at that advocacy with our colleagues in the ambulance service, because think about the pressures of work on us compared to the pressures of work on turning an ambulance round. So with the sort of understanding that Krissie and colleagues and reading the report has given us, we have an advocacy role as well as a putting the water on and a burns treating role. And that's given us confidence. We've built on that, so it's given us confidence for that advocacy and response and inquiring, what does this customer need? You know, what do they need for recovery in what's might be a fairly routine incident for us, but a really difficult thing for them. And it's definitely broadened our thinking, and that's a really good thing across the piece.
Yeah.
Education is huge, and I think that's the thing that is changing constantly with burns. How we combat that, starting with the first aid, so first aid training, changing mentality from 10 minutes to 20 minutes of cooling, utilising partial cooling, so cool the burn and warming the casualty is huge to reduce that hypothermia side of things. And focusing on especially for fire service, we go back to casualty focused, not job focused. And that's sometimes when we look at the slime project and what Krissie delivers, you know, the types of burns that we've seen over the years have got worse, and we can interfere with that at the early phases. So the education piece is something that needs to come out from the first aid at work instructors, trauma and medical instructors, and then into the hospital, pre-hospital world needs to change the most.
And can I just ask a little bit, without going into too much detail of the content of the report, but what were the key things you would say that your recommendations focused on in terms of what you felt fire services could do?
So the burn injury itself happens in a multitude of ways. There's many mechanisms how we can get burnt, but fire service attend most of those emergencies. So if you're in a house fire, the reason why firefighters wear the fire kit and BA sets is they're protecting themselves from the elements that injure my patients, that can injure your lungs, your breathing system, the way that your body then works as a whole, and then injure your skin. And that can have multiple effects on the person being really, really sick for a long period of time. But equally, once wounds heal, and most wounds do heal, they end up with horrendous scarring that doesn't behave in the same way, doesn't stretch in the same way, doesn't sweat, it doesn't produce oil, so it doesn't moisturize itself, and the patient visibly looks different. And the way that we as society respond to those individuals becomes very different. So I feel that the early interventions from the time that the person makes contact with the emergency service and the fire service being there first, we can try and introduce the elements of the report that will prevent me from inhaling the toxic gases, that will protect the areas to me that are going to matter to me as a human: faces, hands, genitals, feet. The things that will make my burn injury less worse, like cooling on the scene, because the next step on, the ambulance service don't carry anywhere near enough water. By the time they get to emergency department, cooling is not prioritized, and by the time they go to remotely placed burn service, cooling is too late to do it. There is a time frame when those interventions are key and effective, and after that time, it's lost, and the consequences are grave. And that could be person you love, that could be your crewmate, and that could just be somebody in your community. And like Richard said, do no harm is the principle by which the medical community live by. Why not all of us? We're there for our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things I read in the report was around a recommendation also to think for fire services to think about their control room staff and how they might be educated. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect? Anyone? Yeah.
Well, certainly. I mean, for us and the view that we take in Kent, and I'm sure we're not alone in fire and rescue services, our control room colleagues are our first incident commanders. They carry out our first triage of an incident, and whether that's fire survival or guidance, whether that's somebody reporting an RTC and asking them to keep themselves safe on the road. So that advice that they can give about cooling, removing garments, irrigating, while we're attending and while obviously they're calling the other services, is a key part of the advice that they can give to callers. So we train our colleagues that work in our control room. We do combined training with our firefighters, so they get the input. They come to events where we have professionals like Krissie in talking, and certainly trainers come to those events in that train the trainer way. And for us, that whole control environment is really vital to what we do, to getting the right response out, but to giving that first aid advice, that whether it's stay safe advice or first aid advice to the people that are contacting us and calling us, and that reassurance that they can act. that they can act in a safe and positive way, and that's a good thing while we are waiting for us and our blue light colleagues to arrive. So vital stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And from your perspective?
Communication's key. Finding that information early to then cascade it to the relevant parties is what we need to see. Sometimes we get, it's a burn, but what type of burn? What's caused it? And then cascading that so it goes to the right emergency service. When it goes to ambulance control, they know that actually it's not just a burn on my finger, it's actually encompassed the whole of the body. So that cascading of information needs to come from scene all the way through, and whether you're fire, ambo, police, responder, passing that information on all the time using whatever acronym you want to use to cascade that information to the final product so that they know from initial burn time to treatment time is where we need to be.
Yeah, very good. I'd have to say from a Jessup perspective, obviously you'd use methane to pass on the information, but I'll stop that. I won't get on that bandwagon. That's really fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. I guess what I want to ask now then is, have there been any challenges around having to try and implement this at a local level, and how did you overcome those?
I suppose the short answer has to be yes. One of the challenges is that confidence. Right. So I'm a trained firefighter. Krissie's a trained nurse operating in this area with years of experience, and she's asking me to do something to support her. That's way outside my skill set and confidence. So how do I get the confidence, particularly when Krissie isn't there then? It's one thing her asking me to support her today here, but 6 months' time, hundreds of miles apart, how do I maintain that confidence? So there's definitely that as a challenge with individuals and with crews, with teams. You're possibly alluding to what the representative bodies think as well. We're a service that's heavily co-responding, and obviously there are views around that gets wrapped up into pay negotiations and the whole role map of a firefighter. But I think particularly when you're looking at burns, we're firefighters, burns are a consequence often of fires. So it's not a very difficult leap of imagination for our colleagues to see that if you can get over the technical competence, the kind of moral imperative of it's a consequence of a fire and we are here to deal with consequences of fires isn't difficult to imagine. And we also deal with chemical burns and we deal with industrial accidents and things like that. So certainly my experience in Kent is that we haven't had a lot of resistance. Where we've had to work with colleagues, it's about that confidence rather than actually this is something we shouldn't be doing. And at the end of the day, if you're thinking about outcomes for the casualty, then we're contributing to positive outcomes, and why would we not want to do that? But our contribution is not reducing the role or the efficacy of other public responders. So you still need your ambulance. You still need your highly qualified ambulance crew. You still need all of those highly qualified staff and colleagues in the hospital environment. So we're not taking away from anybody else's activity, and we are really, in a way that's actually quite difficult to know on an individual basis, but you kind of have to trust the evidence you've been given and the sort of moral imperative behind it. But we are contributing to that positive outcome for somebody, and that's not a difficult concept. So for me, it's I understand the question, but it's the confidence rather than the big sort of, a political issue.
Level of training is still big on the agenda, and until a universal decision is made on the level of training fire and rescue we have a broad spectrum, and depending on where you get that training will tell you different things. So overcoming those areas is very difficult, but the again, rave on about it, the education piece and having it centralised is our key factor. At the end of the day, anyone can treat a burn. It's quite a simple process. It's having that knowledge, that confidence, and just cascading it. If you think it's bad, we then go to the next level of treatment. But I think that's one of the big challenges. Part of my role as a lead instructor is I work with West Sussex Fire and Rescue, and the change in Gatwick's level of training to West Sussex Local Authority is vast, because the amount of calls that we deal with in medical is different. However, fire service related, it still works. So I think changing the way that we approach and going back to casualty focused for every scenario is our only winnable option.
And again, I guess one of the challenges, this came up in a previous session around trauma care, the TRIM process, and every service chooses what they do locally. Whilst there are some national approaches to things, there's nothing nationally saying you must do this or bringing that consistency. Again, my experience at the National Fire Chiefs Council was we were embarking on it, started some years ago, actually from Kent, from Anne Millington, around fire services all generating e-learning packages. Could we try and share those things? Because it strikes me that some of the basic stuff that a firefighter or a member of the control room might need to know could possibly be delivered in an e-learning package, and if that was one and everyone shared it, we'd be getting a bit more consistency, wouldn't we? So that doesn't feel like it should be too difficult to achieve, but then I've been around the space for a while.
I completely, working with the NFCC myself, I get completely where you're coming from. I suppose what I would say is it would be great to have national standards. It would be great to have national packages and things, and we've spoken about that outside of this event, of course. But actually, this is simple stuff, and it's really impactful. Yeah. So I would encourage everybody just to get on and do it. Yeah. You can get the advice, you can read the report, and yes, over time we can work towards those things. But in the meantime, you could actually be helping somebody this afternoon. Yeah. So I'd strongly encourage that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And so. In terms of learning then, after all this, I've talked a little bit about the challenges, or you've talked about the challenges. Have there been any surprise outcomes or some good news stories by the fact that you have implemented this approach in your services?
So for us, seeing a burn survivor, whether they have had a small burn, large burn, it's irrelevant. They're a burn survivor that we're looking at, that casualty. Seeing the impact that we can make on a person's life change from what could be quite a severe outcome, and like Krissie said, with scar tissue forming, we can slow that or reduce that to a manageable effect that actually long term doesn't stop them operating as a firefighter, a doctor, a paramedic, a businessman, businesswoman. We can stop that and reduce that early on. And seeing customers that we have come through Gatwick who have burnt themselves in quite a severe manner, and being able to follow that up with them is brilliant, especially when a lot of our burns are paediatrics, right? Due to hot coffee, hot tea, use of it in an aircraft where there's not an availability of first aid at all cases. That's a brilliant outcome to see how we can interject and slow and reduce that damage to that person from an early onset.
Yeah, excellent.
I think for me and for our experience in Kent, once our colleagues became comfortable with dealing with burns and looking at that casualty-centred approach, so it's okay, there may well be a fire that still needs putting out, but that's, there's no more life risk, and I've got a person in front of me who's suffering. So we've become used to looking at the individual, and we tend to call them customer. I know not everybody likes that, but customer, casualty, call them what you will, but it's centred on a person or a group of people. What we've seen is our colleagues then start to have a sense of inquiry about what else we can do to help. So, and I liken this to the first time anybody talked to me in my career about recovery was when I became a strategic commander and I did the magic course, and we talk about recovery, and we're talking about that for communities after something horrible's happened. But if you go down to that small scale incident, couple of appliances, maybe a police officer, perhaps an ambulance crew, something that we recognise, we deal with fairly regularly. I hate the term bread and butter, but arguably bread and butter. But it isn't bread and butter for the person whose house it is, or car it is, or child it is. This is something that's entirely outside of their experience. And what it's done for us, and it's fantastic that we help an individual with a burn and we make all those differences that Krissie's described, but it's done so much more in terms of opening our mind to what else can we do to help that person, what else can we help with what effectively is the first step of their recovery, and that's a real mindset change for us. And often it's very simple things. It's maybe an earlier bit of advice about what the outcome of the incident is, or an earlier conversation about what can we salvage for you, what will you need to take away from your home if you're not going to be in your home for the next few days, weeks, months, to continue with your life. And and the confidence we've had from saving lives is not enough and dealing with burns has permeated out across what we do. Difficult to quantify, but really fantastic impact.
Yeah, and presumably for the firefighters, you talked about potentially one of the challenges being the confidence of the firefighter to step in. Do they get to see, kind of a good outcome?
That's the difficulty, because and I think there's a slight difference with us here. There, so we deal with a member of the public. We may know very little about them. If it's a domestic, we'll know their address. But if it's on the road, if it's an acid attack or an industrial accident, we probably don't know that. We probably don't need to know that. We'll do our bit, the 20 minutes, we'll hand them to a paramedic, to an ambulance crew, and then effectively they disappear to us. And for patient confidentiality and all the rest of it, well, we don't get those outcomes. We will occasionally get a letter. We'll occasionally get a thank you letter. Sometimes that may happen more often if it involves children, because it's not unheard of for families to bring their child back to thank the crew, and actually that's part of their recovery to see a crew in a normal situation as opposed to an emergency situation. But we don't tend to get that, so we do have to rely on the fact that we've got evidence, clinical evidence presented to us in this instance by Krissie, backed up by research, that this is the right thing to do, and you just have to trust that evidence in that global way rather than feedback to you from me about what you did for me, which in other circumstances in other walks of life you might get. But on the whole, our crews seem quite happy to accept that that's the way we operate and our operating context.
Okay.
But I think that's slightly different in your scenarios, isn't it?
Yeah, we have the opportunities to, if you're going on holiday, you're picking a certain airports, we usually have the opportunity that we can have a follow-up. But clinical GDPR is obviously quite difficult to then follow up at hospital, or if you get to know a crew, they might know what's going on as well.
Okay, and just from a surprises perspective, Krissie, as the author of the report and having all of that evidence behind you and that knowledge, what might have surprised you about how things have gone?
I think I've been really pleasantly surprised by the fact that there are many individual fire services who have had an interest, have asked me to come back and to present and share our experience as a burn service at the end of the story that you never get to see. But the frustrating thing, I suppose, has been the fact that it is just me, and there are many, many of you. So it's really difficult to, kind of from sustainability piece, it's really difficult to get that across. But the positive impact of these in-person presentations is that I've had fire crews from scene who would phone me and say, we attended this and we did this, and oh my God, this person's so much better, and they're feeding back to us. Or I can then follow up and say, yeah, you guys did an amazing job. But it takes normally that personal connection, the reason for doing it. And sometimes it comes through knowledge, sometimes it comes through a personal connection, sometimes it comes from legislation and policy. But we need all of that to try and persuade that. We're talking about survival, and burns survivors survive 80-90% surface area burns. So you could be pretty much most of your area burnt and you can survive that injury nowadays. Medicine is amazing now. But living with the consequences of that injury is very different. So if there's any way that we can offset the consequences that will come unless we do the right thing early on, and I can't be there early on. Burn services are normally 6-12 hours removed from that casualty. That's our first contact. So whoever's there first has an opportunity to literally change a life, and that's why it's so important. So I am really buoyed by the fact that there is interest, but we need more, and it needs to go higher, and we need to all work together. It can't just be siloed in organizations that are in this, because the survivor is the only person that experiences from start to the end.
Really, really good point as well. So I suppose on that point, where do you go next with all of this? What needs to happen now, building on the original report and talking about this again today, which is some years later? So what would you like to happen? What needs to happen?
Ideally, I would love to have a multi-agency national adaptation across the UK. That's what needs to happen. The report is written, the elements are prescribed, we know they're evidence-based, and those elements will make a difference, every one of those points. but we need a buy-in from national bodies. So you guys in the audience today, if you want to take this on, there are QR codes, there are cards on your seats. Take it up to your seniors, take it up to your chiefs, speak to your organizational professional bodies to see if we can make a difference, because it will take all of us to do that. So that's from my point of view, but you guys have actually done it, so probably you'll have a different perspective.
I think training providers make a huge difference. Whether you're with an ambulance service who do medical training, you're with a private company that offer that. But having that input and understanding changes the courses that are provided. Yeah. And I've seen that from delivering first aid at work, initial trauma, advanced life support. It changes throughout, and that comes from the research projects, the interaction with other bodies, and discussions. And that's what's really important about the British Burns Association, the Special Interest Group, working groups. It does make a difference, and it's things that we can take forwards to the NFCC, AFOA, multi-agencies that then will change potentially the burn survivors' outcome.
Okay, thank you.
I think, I essentially agree with everything that's been said. I suppose if you look at it perhaps from the NFCC level, we as NFCC members have lots of pressures, contaminants, the next generation of where we go with PPE, things like that. So pressures on our time, pressures on the public purse, and it's understandable, of course, that you can get lost in those pressures, and that there are many good things that we could and should be involved in, and obviously this is one of them. But my perspective is this is compatible. There are some things that we just need to get on with and do together. So as an individual service, just do it. It isn't difficult. As a collective, there are many compatibilities with this, say with decontamination. So one of the things we've talked about outside of here is water quality. So we can't guarantee the water quality in our appliances. No, we should keep them clean, but we're not giving drinking water. Arguably you might go to an incident where a pump's been used in the village duck pond this morning, and so it's duck pond water this afternoon. Is that in and of itself going to stop you doing the cooling? No, that's manageable by our colleagues in the health services. Perhaps if they knew that it was or do we use what might be dirty water first and then our bottled water at the end to sort of clean? But it shouldn't stop you working on that. But our issues then with water quality would be the same if you wanted to provide welfare for your firefighters, if you wanted to deal with decontamination at the scene. Potentially you could have water filters available for certain circumstances on your appliances, which would be available for this activity or this intervention as well as for other things. So I think there are so many things we're doing that could go hand in glove, and we should be open-minded to that rather than I'm dealing with contaminants today and I may think about this tomorrow. And that's very easy for me to say, of course, but I think that's where as a collective we need to be.
Okay, and we talked earlier on as well about the pressures that have been on the emergency services over the past few years, impacts of austerity, where the focus is, driven often now by inspection outcomes and all sorts of other things, and how work is being prioritised. But it feels to me like this is an ongoing situation of raising profile, PR about the whole thing, and then education and training. That seems a core of it. So, okay. Well, I just want to put the call out to the audience now. Has anyone got a question that they would like to ask or anything they want to know more about? Love.
Rush of hands.
Chrissie, could I meet you and find out what those 10 points are, or can you tell me where to find them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
so
you.
On your QR code, you'll be able to access the whole report, and it's within the first few pages stipulated, and then obviously the rest of the report breaks them down into more detail and research behind it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My question's for Mark. I'm from Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service. You talked about you training your firefighters around burns. Have you put any additional equipment onto the appliances like burn packs and things?
No, we haven't put any additional equipment on. If anything, we've pulled burns gel and things like that away. We carry cling film, but we've carried that for a long time. And this is about using our traditional firefighting facilities, the water we carry, either in the appliance tank or in bottled water, using our persuasive powers to access private showers, what have you, because our advice or what we've taken from the report is water's the answer, and use water think about obviously how you're going to use the water, particularly if you're dealing with chemicals. You may have it on a part of your body, you don't want to wash it over the rest of it, so it perhaps requires a little bit of thought about how you address the casualty with the water, and then you can think about water temperature, think about dignity, particularly if your genitals and so on are involved and you're stripping people off in public, and that's where I come back to, and you'll know this as well as I do, our colleagues can be very persuasive at gaining access to places, so it's approaching it like that rather than giving loads and loads of equipment which obviously has cost, and we haven't done that because of cost, but it has maintenance issues, it has all sorts of things with it, and actually doesn't really bring a lot to the party, whereas the thought and the confidence from the fire crew is what drives this forward, in our opinion.
That's great, thanks very much.
So it feels like from that there's something about the basic education of fighters, for firefighters, so that they know what they can and can't do in a very simplistic way, and then enabling them to put that into practice. That's really good. Okay, any more questions? Yes, sorry.
Hello, my question is, well, it's not even a question, it sort of is. Krissie, your social media content is probably one of the best ways of sharing information that I've ever seen clinically. The people, I don't work within the UK emergency services, I work internationally with ships at sea. So we share content that is accessible to our crew, and our crew have to be first responder firefighters and first aiders. Is there any way that your information can be shared? And I'm thinking yours specifically we share anyway, but from a firefighting perspective, to make it more accessible to the firefighting teams on board, is there anybody doing a similar thing from a firefighter's perspective that we can share as a short soundbite of education for people?
I think that's what Joy was suggesting, is that potentially there is an element of e-learning that we could actually put together that's available nationally. Obviously anyone can access my LinkedIn profile, that's fine. But at the moment the model is not necessarily sustainable, but the report is publicly available, so those learnings are already there. But sometimes it's breaking down the reasons why that is the message, is the bit that persuades. So for me, it so far has been in-person presentations, giving the case studies, giving the patient stories that actually then persuades the service, actually this is what we need to be doing. I don't know, maybe you guys have a different approach, how we can interact and educate nationally.
I think one of the points was how you can take Krissie's information from LinkedIn and cascade it, in a roundabout way.
Sorry, I think what I was trying to say is, we're avid followers of Krissie and learn constantly from her and use her content to cascade to our crew members who are globally working, so we can't do in person with them, It just doesn't happen. But what I found amazingly beneficial today is listening to the firefighter side of the story, because actually Krissie doesn't need to convince me because I'm clinical as well, but actually convincing somebody who isn't clinical what's the right thing to do needs to come from somebody, like a peer-to-peer thing. And because we're dealing with people internationally, it's that, how do we get that message to them from somebody that they can relate to more easily? And I think I was trying to find out if anybody's doing what Krissie does, but from a firefighter's point of view.
So it's something we've literally just talked about, because you could put on discussions and people miss it, they can't attend, and we've almost said it's almost worthwhile to film it and then put that out into the public domain. Obviously it's a lot of work on Krissie, but having it from a burns nurse and the specialist changes perceptions, and changing our perceptions within the fire service, within any industry, is very, very difficult. But when you see success stories and the hard stories that actually go with it, and it sort of tugs at the heartstrings, that's when we start to see the differences being made. So I think the big thing is filming Krissie or AI or however it's done, and then putting it out into that world.
I've kind of got a suggestion here, because ultimately you guys, we're being had by the Emergency Services Show and the Emergency Services Times, which is available to everyone online, right? So maybe we should have a conversation about the Emergency Services Times, see if we could do a kind of three-way interview or something, and have something put in there, and if we can film it and make it into a video for social media, even better. But that would perhaps be one way which we could do something to spread the word.
The other point is, Liz, that one of the things that we learnt in the burn service is that we actually have no idea what happens on scene with the casualties. There isn't the message of how the injury happened or what interventions happen on scene, but also we don't understand the resources of each service that's attending, what their capacity is. So until we started interacting, I actually understood, okay, that's why there's limitations to this, or actually they can bring this to the party and we could utilize that for the benefit of our patients. But until our services start talking and finding out what our challenges are with these really complex casualties, actually the advancements won't happen. So I'm really grateful to these two services that have actually embraced this, are putting it in practice. But until I found out what they can do, I wouldn't ask them to do anything because I didn't know I could.
Certainly our experience in Kent has been having the information from Krissie has been the most influential thing for our firefighters, because burns are hugely complex and lifelong and all the rest of it, but that breaking that complexity and that they're frightening, that for us to see somebody with burns is very frightening. You how do we handle them? Kid gloves. Well, I want a paramedic to get hold of that person as quickly as I can, and then that fright has gone away. So as one firefighter to another, I could say, well, you can do this, it'll work and all the rest of it, and have some impact. But the real impact has been having the message from the professional, from the person and the colleagues who work with the burns, understand the burns, getting that understanding of then what we bring to the party. Actually, we do bring something really quite useful to the party. We just take it for granted. It's parked behind us and it's just there. But actually, we've brought something, and actually we do know how to use it. And we can make the water warm, we could make it clean, and we can persuade people to help us. Understanding that those things we bring to the party, and it's taken somebody from outside the sector who understands her role really well, or the role of her service really well, to give us the confidence. So I take your point about peer-to-peer, but I do think it really comes from having that information. And then peer-to-peer, well, what can we do? We could go and stand in the yard together and challenge each other to run a pump for 20 minutes, making tepid water and not boiling it and not making it cold. You can do those things, but you're doing it in the context of that understanding that's been given to us.
I work in IT, so as a total outsider, I have two questions, and I don't know, they might be really dumb. But first of all, does a firefighter have enough time to take care of a casualty this way? And do they have the capacity? Does it cause any issues for them? And second is that how come the calling isn't prioritized in hospital? That's it, thank you.
Do you want to do the firefighter question first?
Yeah, if I take the fire side. So dependent in organisations, is dependent on the level of training. But we have to go back to basics. Why are we going to a fire? Why are we going to an RTC? It's because there's casualties or potentially persons reporting. The protection of property and humanitarian is always there, but we have to be casualty focused. And how we can change that is put that firefighter in the initial casualty care sector. So giving them the relevant training, whether it be first aid, immediate emergency care, first response emergency care, whatever's there, but giving them the tools and the knowledge to do that in their capacity. So as a incident commander, that will build up as part of the package of, I need to put a casualty carer in place for that whilst I am doing X, Y, Z. And if that means send for more resources, then that's what we do. We've got the resilience there to back up, whether it be local authority, airport, private. That has to be there, and it has to be casualty focused.
And I'll answer why the hospitals are not prioritising first aid. Part of the reason is when the patient is presented to emergency departments, there is, again, the lack of access to water. So either they are significantly injured, that the priorities are airway, breathing, circulation, disability, and by the time you get to assessing the burn injury, it's far down your trauma surveys. And first aid is also not something that healthcare professionals know. We've just run a workshop yesterday for the whole day with 70 nurses who did not know what burns first aid was, how long you're supposed to cool the burn for, and the time frame within which first aid is effective. So if we as professionals are confused, the general members of the public are equally just as confused. So the reason why it's not prioritized is either it's too severe an injury, it's difficult to get somebody to a shower. Emergency departments quite often only have one shower, often in pediatric department, and that doesn't happen. Or you've got mixed taps, but no one really thinks about first aid because we want to get that casualty to the burn service because they need to be with the burn service. But there's only a 3-hour window when your 20 minutes cooling is effective. By the time they come to me, it's way past that time. So unless it's done early, and earlier is more effective in reversing the damage, by the time they're in the emergency department, could be 1 hour later, 2 hours later after the incident, you have limited time frame to intervene. So it's not done because there's lack of knowledge, lack of access, or a bit like the Saving Lives reporters instigating, have a plan. You know you have a burn casualty coming. What are you going to do about cooling them? And once you have that, as you're responding or as you're receiving the casualty into your department, you should already have provisions. And I was guilty in my emergency department, quite often coming in with lots of wet soaks and making the floor a mess. But that takes a person who knows that's important. All the other interventions can still be happening, but you could be cooling simultaneously. It's sad, but it doesn't happen.
Okay, we are definitely out of time now, but that's been really, really interesting. Thank you so much for the questions from the audience as well. Can I ask you to thank our speakers in the usual way? Give them a round of applause. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks for listening. If you like this session, then be sure to browse the rest of the programme for the show. Share the link and subscribe to receive updates on new content from us here at Emergency Services Times.